There are three major processes that occur within the digestive tract once food enters. The first is mechanical digestion, then chemical digestion, and last, absorption. In this short video, we're going to talk about mechanical digestion, which occurs in the gas. So the first thing that happens is food is ingested. Once you ingest food, you start chewing. Chewing is a form of mechanical digestion. It breaks food into smaller pieces so that it can then be pushed to the back of the mouth through a process called propulsion. Then the tongue mixes the food with saliva after the teeth cut and grind it, and swallowing begins. So in the mouth, the first mechanical digestive process is chewing. Once the food gets to the back of the mouth, it passes through the pharynx or throat and esophagus through the process of peristalsis. Just a few words about swallowing or deglutition. It's actually a fairly complicated process that involves the activities of many muscles, including the tongue, soft palate, pharynx, esophagus, and many other muscles. Food moves through the pharynx and then the esophagus through the process of peristalsis. The next place that food is going to go is to the stomach. How long does it take? Well, if it's solid food, it takes about 4 to 8 seconds to go from your mouth to your stomach. But if it's fluid, it only takes 1 to 2 seconds. You might recognize this slide because it's one that you had looked at during your lab on the digestive system. The top of the slide shows you the esophagus. And you can see that from here to here, the tissue lining the inside of the digestive tract, or the esophagus in this case, is stratified squamous epithelium. There are many layers of cells, and the cells on the free edge are flat and thin. But then there's a change that occurs right about here, and this is where the food enters the stomach. So from here down, we are inside the stomach, and you'll notice that the type of tissue lining the lumen is simple columnar epithelium, one layer of tall, thin cells. The junction between the esophagus and the stomach occurs right about here. You can see that change in tissue. This is called the gastroesophageal junction. Once the food passes from the mouth to the pharynx through the esophagus, it enters the stomach. The stomach has several roles. One is to act as a holding tank for ingested food. Another is to mechanically or physically break down the food into smaller pieces and then chemically break down the food even further. By the time the stomach is finished with its process, food exists as something called chyme, which is a creamy paste which results from both the mechanical and chemical digestion of food. The creamy paste is white because the stomach has acid in it, hydrochloric acid, which bleaches it. It also adds enzymes and mucus. Chyme has the consistency of toothpaste. So let's take a look at the anatomy of the stomach. And here you can see in the upper left-hand corner the esophagus. And the food is going to come in and enter the stomach. This part of the stomach right here is called the cardiac region because it's actually close to your heart. This large rounded top of the stomach is called the fundus, and then you'll notice the stomach has a large curve, which is called the greater curvature. On this side, the stomach has a smaller curve, which is called the lesser curvature. You might remember that mesentery is attached to both the greater and lesser curvature. The mesentery attached to the greater curvature is called the greater omentum. And this comes down and covers your small and large intestines. The mesentery attached to the lesser curvature is called the lesser omentum. The middle part of the stomach is called the body, And then this part right before it enters the small intestine, the duodenum, this is called the pyloric region. So again, you have the cardiac region, fundus, the body, and the pyloric region. You'll remember that the stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis externa layer. The longitudinal layer consists of skeletal muscle cells running north to south. The circular layer has skeletal muscle cells running east to west or around the stomach, and the oblique layer has stomach muscle or smooth muscle cells running at a greater than 90-degree angle. Remember that most of the GI tract has only 2 layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis externa, the longitudinal and the circular layer. This third layer in the stomach allows the stomach to grind and pummel the food into small enough pieces so that chemicals can then attack it and break it down into smaller pieces. Some other structures you'll notice is that when the stomach is empty, the mucosa forms these folds, and these are called rugae. Rugae just means folding, and the folds actually increase the area of the stomach for absorption. You'll also find folds, remember, on the roof of your mouth. They are also called rugae there. So when the food enters the stomach into the cardiac and fundic regions, the smooth muscle starts to contract, and you get a gentle rippling type of movement. This starts to break food into smaller pieces, but really doesn't do much of a job of doing that because it's so gentle. So when you look at food that is in the cardiac and fundic regions, it kind of looks like the food after it left your mouth. But as it moves down into the body, the contractions get stronger and the food gets broken down into smaller pieces. And then when it gets into the pyloric region, the contractions of the muscle are very strong. You'll notice in this part is the pyloric valve, which consists of smooth muscle, and this lets the chyme enter the small intestine, the duodenum. When it opens, it only lets a very small amount of chyme through, only about 3 milliliters of chyme is allowed to pass into the duodenum. And that's because the duodenum has to do a chemical breakdown and absorption. In fact, all food particles are broken down chemically in the small intestine, and this is where most absorption takes place. So the small intestine can only handle a little bit of chyme at a time. So when the valve opens, the food rushes forward to push through the valve. Only a small amount of chyme gets through, and then the valve closes, and then the food is going to move back upward as think of it as the gates close. And this is called retropulsion, this movement forward and then back again, which helps to further mix food, mucus, enzymes, and acid. So how long does it take for food to get through the stomach? Well, the stomach typically empties in about 4 to 6 hours. Of course, if your diet is only liquids, it's going to be faster. It's going to empty a lot faster. How much food can your stomach hold? Well, believe it or not, if your stomach is empty and you wanted to see what the volume was, it's about 50 milliliters, which is very small. But if you have a full stomach, so think of after Thanksgiving dinner, it can hold anywhere from 2 to 4 liters of food. That's 2,000 to 4,000 milliliters of food. 4 liters is about equivalent to 1 gallon of food. So think of a gallon of milk inside your stomach. Just a quick reminder about some of the anatomy of the small intestine. This is the major organ of digestion and absorption. So we should say this is the major organ of chemical digestion. So some people think of the small intestine as the star of the digestive system, because this is where most chemical digestion occurs, most absorption occurs, and even mechanical digestion. It's about 70 to 20 feet long, and it starts with the pyloric sphincter, which is in the stomach, and it ends with the ileocecal valve, which then goes into the large intestine. There are three parts: the duodenum, which is retroperitoneal. Remember, that means outside the peritoneum. The jejunum, which is about 8 feet, and the ileum, which is about 12 feet. So how long does it take food to pass through this 70 to 20 foot section? Well, you might think it would be a longer time, than the stomach, but actually the typical time is about 3 to 6 hours. So it takes food 3 to 6 hours to pass through the small intestine. So that means from the duodenum through the ileum. Now, of course, if the food is fatty, it's going to take longer. And the reason it takes longer is that it's harder to chemically break down fat. Let's look a little closer at the anatomy of the small intestine. So we're looking right here, the small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And from the outside, it all looks the same. So you really can't tell from the outside where the duodenum ends and the jejunum starts, or where the jejunum ends and the ileum starts. Can't really tell. If you look on the inside, you can. And one thing you'll notice on the inside of the intestines is there are these circular folds. The mucosa actually comes out and forms these circular folds. And what the circular folds do is actually increase the surface area for absorption. So let's look a little closer at these circular folds, and you'll see in this picture, here's your intestine right here, and you can even see the little folds here. Here's an up-close view, and you can see how the mucosa forms this circular fold. Well, if you look even closer, you'll see that on the circular fold are these finger-like projections from the mucosa, and these are called villi. The villi serve to further increase the surface area for absorption. If you look on the villi, again, these are the villi right here, and you look at the cells that line them, you'll see that these cells have finger-like projections too from their plasma membrane, and these are called microvilli. So if you think about it now, we've got the circular fold increasing the surface area, we have the villi, and we have microvilli. So all of these are going to serve to increase the surface area by a factor of 600 in the small intestines, and that results in an increase in absorption. Okay, so just to reiterate where we are, we started with the mouth, where we have chewing going on, which is mechanical digestion. Then we pass through the pharynx and the esophagus, no mechanical digestion, into the stomach, where the pummeling and churning mechanically breaks down food, and now we're in the small intestine. So is there any mechanical digestion in the small intestine? Well, yes, there is. So mechanical digestion continues in the small intestine, and it occurs through the process of segmentation. Now, you might remember from the beginning of the lecture that segmentation is when non-adjacent parts of the intestines contract. So, for example, one part of the intestine might contract and shoot the food forward, but then underneath the food it might contract and shoot the food back where it came from. And then it might contract in the middle of the food. So as this occurs over and over again, what happens is the food gets broken down further mechanically. This is the process of segmentation. Think of taking a balloon and filling it with Jell-O, and then think of squishing the balloon with your hands on the outside. That's going to break the Jell-O up into little pieces, and that's essentially what's happening in the small intestine through segmentation. So segmentation mechanically breaks down food, but it also mixes the chyme with enzymes in the small intestine that are going to chemically break down the food. After the food has been chemically broken down and everything in it of value has been absorbed, what is left over is basically waste. And that is going to continue through the process of peristalsis, through the intestines and into the large intestine, so through the small to the large. So what is this material that's moving forward? Well, again, it's waste. It consists of remnants of the meal, leftovers of the food that are of no value to you, bacteria, mucosal cells that scraped off during the process segmentation, and other debris. So now we move into the large intestine. And what happens in the large intestine? Is there any mechanical digestion? And the answer would be no. So there is no mechanical digestion in the large intestine. And this is because it's waste. So there's no need to further break it down because it's not going to be absorbed. So this might be a good time to just talk about how the waste moves through the large intestine. So I'm going to skip to the next slide here. The main job of the large intestine is to move indigestible food out of the body. So again, the main job is to move indigestible food to the anus and out of the body. So if we take a look here, you can see here is, right here is where the ileum is. It's the end of the ileum, the end of the small intestine, and it's emptying into the beginning of the large. Here's the ileocecal valve that controls the movement. And you'll notice that this structure here is basically the colon. So we have the ascending colon because it's heading upward, transverse colon, and then descending colon because it's headed downward. And then you move into what's called the sigmoid colon. It's kind of squiggly, and finally into the rectum and out through the anus. Now you'll notice that the colon is actually held in place by mesentery called the transverse mesocolon. This attaches the transverse colon to the posterior body wall and gives it this figure almost of a picture frame. You'll also notice that the colon is bunched up in something called a haustrum. And the reason it's bunched up is that running through the center is a strip of smooth muscle called the tennae coli. The tennae coli contracts, and as it does, it causes this bunching, almost the same as strings on a purse would cause a purse to bunch up. So what happens is, as the waste moves in, it first fills up this little kind of back alley area called the cecum. So this is the cecum. It's shaped kind of like the letter C. And sticking off the cecum, you'll notice, is something called the vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm in Latin, because some people think the appendix looks like a worm. The appendix is actually a vestigial organ. That means it's something left over from the evolutionary process, something we have that doesn't appear to have any role. Lining the vermiform appendix is lymphoid tissue, and there's a little sphincter here. So generally the waste moves into the cecum and then it moves back up this way. But sometimes it can get stuck inside the appendix. And when that happens, it can clog the opening and then you get inflammation. And if it inflames too much, it can burst and all the waste and bacteria enters the peritoneal cavity, which is very serious and can cause a serious infection. That's called appendicitis. But let's move on. Let's follow the path of waste through the large intestine. So what happens is, as the food packs into the first haustrum, it slowly fills it until it's bulging. And once that happens, it triggers a stretch reflex, which causes the smooth muscle to contract and move the waste into the next haustrum. And once that fills, it triggers a stretch reflex that causes the smooth muscle to contract and move the waste into the next haustrum. So you can see that this process is very slow. In fact, waste can sit in the large intestine for about 12 to 24 hours. 12 to 24 hours. Most of the time, the large intestine is actually inactive, not doing a whole lot. One thing that can trigger it, if we just go back for a minute, is something called the gastrocolic reflex. And that is when you eat food and it hits your stomach, it can trigger a reflex that causes peristalsis in the colon. And some of you might experience that if you eat food on an empty stomach in the morning, you might feel the colon start to move the food along. By the way, most of the colon is retroperitoneal. So remember, this means outside the peritoneum. Sorry. And that would include all of the colon except for the transverse. So ascending colon is retroperitoneal, descending colon is retroperitoneal. So what happens when it gets to the end? Well, once the waste starts to fill up the sigmoid colon, it starts to bulge. And as it does, it triggers stretch receptors, which travel to the spinal cord, which triggers a reflex. And the reflex causes the internal anal sphincters, which are smooth muscle right on the inside of the rectum, to relax. Now, once that happens, the waste moves further into the rectum, and that triggers another reflex. This one travels to your cerebral cortex and tells you, it's full down here, what do you want to do? Then you can consciously decide to relax the external anal sphincter, which are made of skeletal muscles. If it's not a convenient time, you can say, external anal sphincters, do not relax, stay tight. So again, the reason you control the external anal sphincters but not the internal is external are skeletal muscle, which are under your voluntary control, and internal are smooth muscle, which are not under your voluntary control. During the process of defecation, not only do the sphincters relax, but in addition, you will close the glottis, which remember is the space between the vocal cords, contract the diaphragm and abdominal muscles. This increases the pressure around the rectum, which helps move the material out. And that's it for mechanical digestion.